I am Margot, and I never imagined that the phone call that would vindicate my entire existence would come at the exact moment my own family was trying to erase me from theirs. But before I tell you how I dismantled a dynasty that spent decades treating me like their dirty little secret, let me know where you're watching from and hit subscribe. You'll want to see how this ends. Growing up as the middle child in the Whitfield family meant living in a world where success had very specific parameters. My older brother Clarence was destined for law, Harvard Law, naturally, followed by a partnership at the family firm that had been established 3 generations before I was even born. My younger sister Beatrice was the golden child, beautiful and charming, married to old money before she turned 25. And then there was me, the one who always colored outside the lines. While Clarence was memorizing case law, and Beatrice was perfecting her tennis backhand at the country club, I was hunched over financial statements in my bedroom, teaching myself to read market trends, like other kids read comic books. By age 14, I was tracking stock performances and writing detailed analyses that my high school economics teacher said belonged in graduate-level coursework. But when I excitedly shared my latest discovery about emerging market patterns at family dinner, my father would simply nod politely and ask Clarence about his debate team victories instead. The Whitfields had built their reputation on tradition, stability, and doing things the proper way. My grandfather had established Whitfield & Associates as a respectable estate planning firm, and my father had dutifully expanded it into wealth management for their circle of equally traditional clients. The family name meant something in our small Connecticut town. It meant reliability, old-fashioned values, and never taking unnecessary risks. I represented everything they feared: change, unpredictability, and worst of all, ambition, that couldn't be contained within their carefully constructed boundaries. When I announced I was applying to Harvard Business School instead of following the family path into law, you'd have thought I declared my intention to join the circus. My mother, Patricia, spent weeks trying to convince me that business was too aggressive for someone of my background. "Whitfield women don't chase money, dear," she'd say while polishing the silver that had been in our family for generations. "We marry well and support our husbands' careers." But I wasn't interested in marrying my way into significance. I wanted to build something that mattered, something that would make the financial world take notice. While my classmates at Harvard were networking at wine tastings and plotting their paths to Goldman Sachs, I was studying the patterns that most people missed. The subtle indicators that predicted when companies were ripe for strategic partnerships, when industries were on the verge of major shifts, when timing and vision could create opportunities worth hundreds of millions. My family's reaction to my Harvard acceptance was telling. Clarence got a celebration dinner at the yacht club when he was accepted to law school. Beatrice received a new car when she got engaged. I got a concerned conversation about whether I was sure this was the right fit for someone with my temperament. The thing about being perpetually underestimated is that it teaches you to find validation from within. While my family worried I was becoming too ambitious, too aggressive, too much like those other types of people, I was quietly building expertise that would eventually reshape how corporate mergers were structured in the mid-market space. Every dismissive comment, every concerned glance, every time they changed the subject when I tried to share my achievements, it all became fuel. They wanted me to be smaller, quieter, more manageable. Instead, I became absolutely relentless in my pursuit of the kind of success that couldn't be ignored, inherited, or explained away as luck. By the time I graduated Harvard, I had already identified the exact niche where I could make my mark: facilitating mergers between traditional family businesses and innovative tech companies. It was a space where my understanding of both worlds, the conservative, relationship-based approach of old money and the disruptive, data-driven strategies of new industries, would become my greatest competitive advantage. But tonight, sitting in my apartment choosing what to wear to yet another family dinner, where my achievements would be politely acknowledged and quickly forgotten, I finally had the ammunition I needed to show them exactly who they'd been underestimating all these years. The pattern started early and never deviated. I can trace it back to my 16th birthday, when I had just landed my first internship at a local investment firm. Completely on my own merit, I might add. I was so proud that I'd convinced a real financial advisor to let me shadow him during market hours, learning about portfolio management and client relations. It felt like the first step toward everything I wanted to become. That same week, Clarence had won some regional debate tournament. Nothing against debate teams, but this was maybe his fourth or fifth similar victory. Yet when we sat down for Sunday dinner, guess which achievement dominated the conversation for 45 minutes straight? My parents invited the neighbors over to hear about Clarence's brilliant closing argument technique, while my internship got a brief, "That's nice, dear," before they moved on to discussing Beatrice's upcoming cotillion dress fitting. I remember sitting there, stabbing my roast beef with more force than necessary, wondering what exactly I had to accomplish to earn the same enthusiasm. The answer, as it turned out, was nothing. Because nothing I did would ever fit their definition of noteworthy achievement. Harvard Business School should have been my vindication moment. When that acceptance letter arrived, I genuinely thought things would change. Here was proof that I belonged in the same conversation as the brightest minds in finance and business strategy. But my acceptance celebration lasted exactly as long as it took my mother to start worrying about whether I'd meet the right kind of people there, and whether all that ambition might make me intimidating to potential suitors. Meanwhile, when Clarence got into Harvard Law 6 months later, they threw him a party with 50 guests and hired a photographer. The local newspaper ran a feature story about the next generation of legal excellence in the Whitfield family. I kept my Harvard acceptance letter in my bedroom drawer and learned not to bring it up unless directly asked. The pattern continued through every milestone. When I graduated summa cum laude and was recruited by 3 top-tier consulting firms, the family dinner conversation centered on Beatrice's engagement to Preston Hartwell III, whose family owned half the waterfront properties in Newport. When I earned my first promotion and a salary that exceeded what most people made after a decade in their careers, they were planning Beatrice's wedding and discussing flower arrangements. But the moment that crystallized everything happened 3 years ago, at Thanksgiving dinner. I had just closed my first major deal, facilitating a partnership between a century-old manufacturing company and a cutting-edge automation firm. The transaction was worth $47 million, and my commission alone was more than my father's annual income. I was 28 years old, and already earning a reputation as someone who could bridge the gap between traditional business practices and innovative technologies. I made the mistake of sharing this achievement during dessert, thinking surely this would finally register as significant. My Uncle Harold, who'd had a few too many whiskeys, actually laughed out loud. "Margot," he said, "it's wonderful that you're keeping yourself busy with all these business activities, but don't you think it's time to focus on what really matters? You're not getting any younger, and Beatrice is already giving us beautiful grandchildren." Beatrice, who had married Preston and immediately retreated into a life of charity galas and tennis lessons, smiled that perfect smile she'd been practicing since childhood. "Uncle Harold's right," she said, bouncing her 6-month-old daughter on her lap. "I can't imagine anything more fulfilling than being a mother. All that career stress just seems so exhausting." The table erupted in agreement. Here was their proof that Beatrice had chosen the superior path, the path that led to grandchildren and Sunday dinners and carrying on family traditions. My $47 million deal might as well have been monopoly money for all the respect it earned at that table. That night, lying in my childhood bedroom under the same floral wallpaper I'd stared at during countless sleepless nights as a teenager, I made myself a promise. The next time I sat at their dinner table, I wouldn't be sharing news about a deal or a promotion or another professional milestone they could dismiss. I would be announcing something so significant, so undeniably impressive, that even they couldn't minimize it or change the subject to discuss Beatrice's latest charity committee appointment. What I didn't know then was that I was already in the early stages of orchestrating exactly that kind of achievement. The merger I'd been quietly working on for 18 months was about to become the kind of success story that makes headlines, breaks records, and forces people to completely reconsider who you are and what you're capable of accomplishing. The idea that would change everything came to me during the most mundane moment possible. Standing in line at a coffee shop near my office, overhearing two executives from completely different industries complaining about the exact same problem. The first was Gerard Whitman, CEO of Whitman Precision Manufacturing, a fourth-generation family business that produced high-end industrial components. He was venting to his colleague about how his company had all the infrastructure and expertise to scale dramatically, but lacked the technological innovation to compete with overseas manufacturers who were automating everything. Behind him stood Donna Kelly, founder of Kelly Tech Solutions, whose company had developed revolutionary automation software that could triple manufacturing efficiency. She was frustrated because her tech was brilliant, but she couldn't break into the established manufacturing networks that still operated on handshake deals and generational relationships. Standing there with my overpriced latte, listening to these two people describe perfectly complementary problems, I had what I can only describe as a lightning bolt moment. This wasn't just about facilitating a simple business partnership. This was about creating an entirely new model for how traditional manufacturing could evolve in the digital age. That night, I went home and spent 14 hours straight researching everything I could find about both companies. Whitman Manufacturing had been struggling with declining margins for 3 years, but their client relationships were rock solid and their quality reputation was unmatched. Kelly Tech had the intellectual property to revolutionize manufacturing efficiency, but needed credibility and established market access to scale their technology. The more I dug, the more convinced I became that a merger between these companies wouldn't just benefit both parties, it would create a new category of manufacturing business that could dominate the market for decades. But here's what made this opportunity different from every other deal I'd worked on. I decided not to approach it as a traditional consultant facilitating someone else's transaction. Instead, I would structure myself as a founding partner in the merged entity. I would use my own money, my own reputation, and my own expertise to make this happen. If it worked, I wouldn't just earn a commission, I would own a piece of something revolutionary. The next 18 months became a masterclass in patience, strategy, and sheer determination. I had to convince Gerard Whitman that partnering with a tech startup wouldn't destroy his family's legacy, while simultaneously convincing Donna Kelly that merging with a traditional manufacturer wouldn't stifle her innovation. Neither of them had ever heard of me, which meant every meeting started with proving my credibility from scratch. I spent my weekends in Gerard's factory in Ohio, learning every detail of their manufacturing processes and building relationships with his longtime employees. I spent my evenings in Donna's cramped office space in Silicon Valley, understanding the intricacies of her automation algorithms and helping her team refine their implementation strategies. The financial structuring alone took 8 months to perfect. This wasn't just about determining company valuations. I was creating an entirely new business model that would preserve Whitman's traditional strengths while leveraging Kelly's innovative capabilities. The legal documentation filled 3 bankers' boxes and required coordinating lawyers in 4 different states. During this entire period, my family remained completely oblivious to what I was building. When they asked about work, I gave vague answers about consulting projects and client development. When I missed family events because I was traveling between Ohio and California, they assumed I was struggling to maintain steady employment. When I looked exhausted at family gatherings, they attributed it to the stress of trying to make it in such a competitive field. The irony was perfect. While they worried I was failing to establish myself professionally, I was actually orchestrating the largest mid-market manufacturing merger in 3 years. While they suggested I consider something more stable, I was negotiating terms that would value the combined entity at over $500 million. The breakthrough came on a Tuesday in March, when both CEOs finally agreed to the merger structure I'd proposed. We signed the preliminary agreements in Gerard's conference room, surrounded by family photos spanning 4 generations of Whitman manufacturing. Donna flew in from California specifically for the signing, and as we shook hands on the deal that would transform both their companies, I realized I had just accomplished something that would reshape my entire life. That night, alone in my hotel room, I calculated my ownership stake in the merged company. Based on the projected valuations and my equity position, I had just become worth approximately $43 million on paper. But more importantly, I had proven that my instincts about bridging traditional business with innovative technology weren't just theoretical. They were the foundation for building something extraordinary. The final paperwork was supposed to be signed today, 3 hours before I needed to leave for my mother-in-law's annual family appreciation dinner, a tradition that had tortured me for the past 6 years. The merger documentation sat in neat stacks across my dining room table, each page representing months of negotiation, strategy, and careful maneuvering that would officially make me one of the youngest self-made millionaires in the manufacturing sector. But Donna's lawyer had requested a 48-hour extension to review the tax implications of the international licensing agreement. 48 hours, that meant I'd be walking into Eleanor Whitfield's dining room tonight, still technically unemployed, as far as my in-laws knew, still the family disappointment who'd married their son and somehow convinced him to abandon his proper career trajectory. I stared at myself in the bedroom mirror, trying to decide between the navy dress that made me look presentable or the burgundy one that made me feel powerful. My husband Trevor had already left for his mother's house. He always went early to help with the setup, which really meant an hour of Eleanor's undivided attention to remind him of everything he'd given up when he married me. Trevor and I had met at Harvard, where he was studying for his MBA, with plans to eventually take over his family's investment firm. He was smart, kind, and completely unaware that his trust fund confidence was both attractive and occasionally infuriating. When we started dating, I thought I'd found someone who understood ambition, who appreciated that I wanted to build something meaningful rather than just inherit something established. But the minute we got engaged, the pressure started. Eleanor Whitfield had very specific ideas about what kind of wife her son needed. Someone who would enhance the family's social standing, host elegant dinner parties, and produce beautiful grandchildren who would carry on the Whitfield legacy. Someone like Trevor's sister-in-law Penelope, who'd married his older brother Jasper and immediately transformed into the perfect society wife. The irony was that I actually liked Trevor's family when I first met them. They were sophisticated, well-traveled, and genuinely interested in current events and cultural discussions. But once it became clear that I intended to maintain my own career rather than becoming a full-time wife and future mother, the dynamic shifted. Suddenly, every conversation became a subtle interrogation about my priorities, my timeline for children, and whether I really understood what being a Whitfield meant. Tonight's dinner was particularly loaded because it was also celebrating the 5th anniversary of Jasper and Penelope's wedding. Penelope had spent those 5 years becoming everything Eleanor wanted in a daughter-in-law. She'd learned French cooking, joined the hospital board, hosted charity events, and produced 2 adorable children who called Eleanor Grandmère and could already play piano. Meanwhile, I'd spent those same 5 years building a career that the family viewed as an extended phase I'd eventually outgrow once I came to my senses and settled into my proper role. The worst part was that Trevor genuinely didn't understand why these dinners bothered me so much. He'd grown up in this world where success was measured in family legacy and social connections, rather than individual achievement. When I tried to explain how dismissed I felt, he'd remind me that his family just needed time to adjust to someone with my background and ambitions. My background. As if being middle class and self-motivated was some kind of character flaw that required patience and understanding to overlook. I chose the burgundy dress and added the pearl necklace my own grandmother had left me, a small armor of family history that didn't come with strings attached or expectations about how I should live my life. The drive to Eleanor's estate in Greenwich would take 45 minutes, which gave me exactly enough time to mentally prepare for the evening's routine. Polite questions about whether I was still doing that consulting work, concerned observations about how tired I looked, gentle suggestions about scaling back my professional commitments, and subtle reminders that Penelope had found such fulfillment in focusing on family. What they didn't know was that tomorrow morning, assuming Donna's lawyer approved the final terms, I would officially become a founding partner in a company valued at over $500 million. My personal stake would make me worth more than the combined assets of everyone who would be sitting around Eleanor's dinner table tonight. But as I locked my apartment and headed toward what I expected to be another evening of polite humiliation, I had no idea that this particular family dinner would be different. I had no idea that my phone would ring at exactly the right moment with exactly the right news to change everything. Some vindication comes when you least expect it, in the precise moment when you need it most. Eleanor Whitfield's estate looked like something out of Architectural Digest, all manicured hedges and windows that sparkled even in the twilight. The circular driveway could accommodate 12 cars comfortably, though tonight only family vehicles were present: Jasper's Range Rover, Penelope's pristine Mercedes, and Trevor's BMW that his parents had given him for graduation. My Honda Civic looked like the helps car parked among them. Trevor met me at the front door before I could even ring the bell. "You look beautiful," he said, kissing my cheek, but I caught the slight tension around his eyes. "Mother's been asking about your work situation again. Maybe tonight we could focus on other topics." Translation: Please don't mention anything that will remind my family that you have professional ambitions that extend beyond supporting my career. The foyer was exactly as intimidating as always, with its crystal chandelier and oil paintings of Whitfield ancestors dating back to the 1800s. Eleanor appeared almost instantly, as if she'd been waiting just out of sight to make her entrance. At 62, she was still stunning in that particular way of women who'd never worked a day in their lives but had perfected the art of looking effortlessly elegant. "Margot, darling," she said, offering her cheek for the obligatory air kiss. "You look well rested? I hope that means work has been less demanding lately?" The way she said work made it sound like a hobby I'd eventually outgrow, like collecting stamps or learning pottery. "Actually, things have been quite busy," I replied, following her toward the living room where I could already hear voices and the gentle clink of crystal glasses. "Oh, that's such a shame," Eleanor continued without missing a beat. "I was hoping you might finally have time to join Penelope's book club. They're reading the most fascinating biography of Jackie Kennedy, and I know you'd have such interesting insights about finding your place in a prominent family." We entered the living room, where the rest of the family was already assembled around the marble fireplace. Jasper, Trevor's older brother, looked exactly like what central casting would order for successful investment banker: tall, confident, with the kind of tan that comes from weekend sailing rather than actual work outdoors. Penelope was curled up beside him on the ivory sofa, looking like she'd stepped out of a Ralph Lauren catalog, her blonde hair perfectly styled, and her smile radiating the contentment of someone whose biggest decision that day was which charity luncheon to attend. "Margot!" Penelope exclaimed, jumping up to hug me with the enthusiasm of someone genuinely happy to see me. This was the most frustrating thing about Penelope. She wasn't actually mean-spirited. She was simply so completely satisfied with her traditional role that she couldn't fathom why anyone would want anything different. "I've been meaning to call you," she continued. "The hospital auxiliary is looking for someone to help organize their spring gala, and I immediately thought of you. With all your business experience, you'd be perfect for handling vendor negotiations and budget management." "That's very thoughtful," I managed, accepting the glass of wine that Jasper handed me. "But my schedule is pretty packed through the summer." "Still working on those consulting projects?" Jasper asked, settling back into his chair with the casual confidence of someone who'd never had to prove his worth to anyone. "I keep telling Mother you should let me introduce you to some people at the firm. We're always looking for bright women to handle our smaller client accounts." The condescension was so smooth, so perfectly delivered with a smile, that it took a moment to fully register. Smaller client accounts. As if my Harvard MBA and 6 years of successfully facilitating multi-million-dollar deals qualified me to handle their overflow work. That's generous, I said, taking a sip of wine that probably cost more than most people's weekly grocery budget. But I'm actually working on something fairly significant right now. Eleanor settled into her favorite chair, the one positioned perfectly to oversee all conversation. How wonderful, dear. What kind of consulting project? Here was the moment I'd dreaded. How do you explain that you're orchestrating a $500 million merger to people who think your professional life is an extended phase you'll eventually abandon? How do you describe the complexity of bridging traditional manufacturing with cutting-edge technology to a family that considers your career a cute distraction from your real purpose? It's a merger facilitation, I said. Between a manufacturing company and a tech firm. How nice, Eleanor replied with the exact tone she might use to acknowledge that I'd taken up watercolor painting. And this is through the consulting firm you work for? Actually, I'm working independently on this one. The silence that followed lasted exactly 3 seconds too long. Jasper and Eleanor exchanged the briefest glance, the kind of look parents share when their teenager announces they're dropping out of college to become a professional musician. Well, Eleanor said finally, I hope you're being careful about taking on too much responsibility without proper institutional support. Dinner was served in Eleanor's formal dining room, where place cards ensured I sat directly across from Penelope, perfectly positioned to absorb every detail of her perfectly curated life. The conversation flowed through safe topics: Jasper's recent promotion to senior partner, the children's piano recitals, Eleanor's upcoming charity auction for the symphony. I was managing to hold my own, contributing appropriately to discussions about local politics and recent theater productions, when Penelope innocently destroyed me with the most well-intentioned question imaginable. Margot, I've been wondering, she said, pausing to cut her salmon into precise, elegant bites. When you and Trevor start having children, do you think you'll continue with the consulting work? I ask because I used to think I'd go back to my marketing job after having Emma, but once she arrived, I couldn't imagine leaving her with someone else. The question hung in the air like incense, sweet and suffocating. Every face at the table turned toward me with polite interest, waiting for my response to what they clearly considered a reasonable inquiry about my future priorities. Trevor reached for my hand under the table, a gesture meant to be supportive but which felt more like an anchor dragging me underwater. We haven't really discussed a specific timeline, I said carefully. Oh, but surely you've thought about it, Eleanor interjected with the tone of someone who genuinely couldn't comprehend any other perspective. I mean, at some point, every woman has to make the choice between career and family. And really, when you think about it, there's no choice at all. Children need their mothers, especially in those crucial early years. Mother, Trevor said quietly, but Eleanor was just getting started. I'm not saying this to be unkind, Margot, she continued, her voice warm with what she clearly believed was maternal wisdom. It's simply reality. Look at Penelope. She's created such a beautiful life for her family. The children are thriving. Jasper can focus completely on building his career, and she's still able to contribute to the community through her volunteer work. Penelope beamed at the praise, completely oblivious to how her supposed success story was being used as a weapon against me. And frankly, Eleanor went on, I think all this business consulting has been wonderful for you as a learning experience, but at some point you have to ask yourself, what's the end game? Are you planning to spend your entire life chasing after deals and transactions, or are you going to settle down and build something meaningful? Something meaningful. As if facilitating mergers that employed thousands of people and generated millions in economic activity was somehow less meaningful than hosting charity luncheons and organizing playdate calendars. Jasper cleared his throat and leaned forward with the expression of someone about to deliver uncomfortable but necessary truth. Look, Margot, we all admire your ambition. But Mother has a point. This merger project you mentioned, even if it goes well, what's next? Another project, then another one after that? At what point do you step back and focus on what really matters? Trevor's career is really taking off, Eleanor added. He's being considered for the international division, which would be a tremendous opportunity. But positions like that require a certain kind of wife, someone who can represent the family properly at client events and industry functions. I felt Trevor's hand tighten on mine, and when I looked at him, I saw something that made my stomach drop. He wasn't going to defend me. He was sitting there, listening to his family systematically dismantle my professional identity, and he was nodding along. "You know what?" Eleanor said, setting down her wine glass with the decisive gesture of someone reaching a final conclusion. "I think it's time we had an honest conversation about expectations." The temperature in the room seemed to drop 10 degrees. Jasper and Penelope exchanged glances, and even Trevor looked uncomfortable, though not uncomfortable enough to interrupt his mother. "Margot, dear, we've been patient. We've tried to be understanding about your need to explore different options before settling down. But you've been married to our son for 6 years now, and frankly, we're concerned about your priorities." She paused, letting the weight of her words settle over the table like a storm cloud. "This family has certain standards, certain expectations about how we conduct ourselves, and what we value. We believe in supporting each other, in putting family first, and in understanding that some things matter more than personal ambition." I could feel my face burning, but I remained silent, fascinated in the most horrible way by where this was heading. "So here's what we're going to do," Eleanor continued, her voice taking on the tone of someone delivering a final ultimatum. "We're going to give you 1 year to decide what kind of person you want to be. 1 year to choose between continuing down this path of endless professional pursuing or embracing your role as Trevor's wife and a future mother to our grandchildren." She looked directly at me, her expression both sympathetic and implacable. "Because if you can't make that choice, if you can't commit to being the kind of wife and family member we need you to be, then I think it's best for everyone if we consider this relationship a mistake that needs to be corrected." The silence that followed Eleanor's ultimatum was deafening. I sat there, my salmon growing cold on my plate, trying to process the fact that I had just been given a formal deadline to abandon my professional identity or lose my marriage. The woman across from me had just calmly informed me that my 6 years of building a career, my Harvard MBA, and my current success meant nothing compared to my failure to produce grandchildren and host dinner parties. Trevor was staring at his hands, his face flushed with embarrassment, though I couldn't tell if he was embarrassed by his mother's bluntness or by my failure to gracefully accept her guidance. Jasper was nodding slowly, as if Eleanor had just articulated something he'd been thinking for years. Penelope looked genuinely confused, clearly unable to understand why anyone would struggle with such a reasonable request to prioritize family over career. "Eleanor," I finally managed, my voice sounding strange and distant, "I think there might be some misunderstanding about—" "There's no misunderstanding, dear," she interrupted gently. "We're simply being honest about expectations that perhaps should have been clearer from the beginning. This family has prospered for 4 generations by understanding priorities, by knowing what matters and what doesn't." She reached across the table and patted my hand with the condescending kindness of someone explaining basic mathematics to a slow child. "Your little business projects are charming, truly. But at some point, every woman has to grow up and accept her real responsibilities. Look around this table, Margot. Look at what we've built together. Jasper is expanding the firm internationally. Penelope is raising 2 beautiful children while supporting important community causes, and Trevor is positioned to become one of the youngest managing directors in the company's history. And what do you have to show for 6 years of marriage?" Jasper added, his tone not unkind but absolutely final. "Some consulting contracts and a lot of stress. Meanwhile, you're 31 years old, your biological clock is ticking, and you're still acting like career success is more important than building a legacy." I felt something breaking inside me. Some last vestige of hope that these people might eventually see me as valuable for who I was, rather than disappointed in me for who I wasn't. The worst part was the genuine concern in their voices, as if they truly believed they were helping me understand a fundamental truth I'd been too stubborn to accept. Trevor finally looked up from his hands. "Margot," he said quietly, "maybe we should consider what they're saying. I mean, the international position would mean a significant salary increase, and we could afford a really nice house, maybe start thinking about a family." His voice trailed off, but the implication was clear. He was siding with them. After 6 years of marriage, after countless conversations about my ambitions and dreams, he was suggesting that maybe it was time for me to be realistic about my limitations. That's when my phone rang. The sound cut through the oppressive atmosphere like a fire alarm. Everyone at the table turned to stare at my purse as if it had personally offended them. Eleanor's expression shifted to barely concealed irritation. Clearly, answering a business call during family dinner would be the final proof of my inappropriate priorities. "I'm sorry," I said, reaching for my phone, "but I need to take this." "Margot," Trevor said urgently, "surely it can wait," but I was already looking at the caller ID, and my heart stopped. Donna Kelly. There was only one reason she would be calling me at 8:30 on a Thursday evening. "I have to answer this," I said, standing up from the table despite the collective look of disapproval from everyone present. "Margot," Eleanor said firmly, "we are in the middle of an important family discussion." "This is important too," I replied, walking toward the French doors that led to Eleanor's perfectly manicured garden. I stepped outside into the cool evening air and pressed the answer button with trembling hands. "Donna? Margot?" Her voice was practically vibrating with excitement. "I hope I'm not interrupting anything important, but I couldn't wait until tomorrow to tell you. The lawyers just finished their review, and everything is perfect. We're ready to sign. The merger is officially happening." My legs felt weak. Through the French doors, I could see the Whitfield family continuing their conversation, probably discussing my rudeness in taking a business call during their family intervention. "The final valuation numbers came in higher than we projected," Donna continued. "Based on your equity position and the market projections, Margot, you're looking at a personal stake worth approximately $57 million. $57 million. I had to ask Donna to repeat the number because my brain couldn't process what I was hearing. Through the French doors I could see Eleanor gesturing emphatically while Trevor nodded along, probably reinforcing every point about my misplaced priorities and need to focus on what really mattered. "Margot? Are you there?" Donna's voice pulled me back to the conversation that was reshaping my entire life. "Yes, I'm here. I'm just processing. I know it's a lot to take in. Gerard is over the moon. He keeps saying this is going to save his company and honor his grandfather's legacy at the same time. And honestly, Margot, none of this would have happened without your vision. You saw something that none of us could see, and you made it happen." I pressed my back against the cool stone wall of Eleanor's terrace, trying to ground myself in reality. Inside that dining room, my husband's family was delivering their final verdict on my worthlessness as a wife and family member. They were explaining with genuine concern for my well-being why I needed to abandon my professional ambitions and accept my proper role in their dynasty. And I had just become worth more money than their entire family's combined net worth. "The press release goes out tomorrow morning," Donna continued. "We're calling it the most innovative mid-market manufacturing merger of the year. Forbes wants to interview you about the strategic vision behind bridging traditional manufacturing with automation technology." Forbes wanted to interview me about my strategic vision. "Donna," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. "What time tomorrow morning?" 8 a.m. Eastern. Why?" "Just curious about timing." I glanced back through the French doors, where Penelope was now speaking animatedly, probably sharing her perspective on the fulfillment that comes from choosing family over career. "Margot, I hope you understand what you've accomplished here," Donna said. "This isn't just about the money, though obviously that's life-changing. You've created a new model for how established businesses can evolve without losing their identity. You've proven that someone with vision and determination can facilitate transformations that seemed impossible." "Thank you," I managed. "I'll call you tomorrow to discuss next steps. Enjoy celebrating tonight, you've earned it." I hung up and stood in Eleanor's garden for a full minute, letting the magnitude of the situation wash over me. The irony was so perfect, it felt like fiction. While my in-laws were inside delivering their ultimatum about choosing between career and family, about understanding what really mattered, about growing up and accepting my limitations, I had just achieved something that would redefine the entire trajectory of my life. $57 million. At 31 years old. From a deal I had structured, negotiated, and managed entirely on my own vision and expertise. But more than the money, more than the financial independence that would make their threats about correcting this relationship completely meaningless, was the validation. 3 companies, dozens of lawyers, hundreds of employees, and millions of dollars in economic impact. All because I had seen an opportunity that others missed, and had the skills to make it happen. When I walked back into that dining room, I would be walking in as someone who had just accomplished more in 2 years than most business professionals achieve in entire careers. I would be facing people who had spent the evening explaining why my professional life was a distraction from my real purpose, while I had actually been building something extraordinary. The question was, what did I want to do with this knowledge? I could walk back in there and quietly announce my success, watch them scramble to recalibrate their assessment of my worth and value. I could enjoy their shocked expressions and awkward attempts to reframe their previous dismissiveness. Or I could let them continue their intervention, let them finish explaining exactly how little they thought of my capabilities and potential, and then respond from a position of strength they couldn't have imagined. As I reached for the door handle to rejoin the family meeting that was supposed to determine my future, I realized I had spent 6 years trying to earn respect from people who were fundamentally incapable of seeing me as anything other than a disappointment. Tonight, that was finally going to change. But not in the way they expected. I walked back into the dining room with the kind of calm that comes from holding cards so powerful that the game has already been won, even if the other players don't know it yet. The family conversation paused as I took my seat, all eyes on me with varying degrees of disapproval for my breach of dinner table etiquette. "I apologize for the interruption," I said, folding my napkin back onto my lap with deliberate care. "Please, continue. I believe you were explaining my limitations." Eleanor straightened in her chair, clearly pleased that I was finally ready to receive her wisdom properly. "As I was saying, Margot, this isn't about judgment. It's about understanding reality. Every successful family requires sacrifice and compromise, and frankly, we're concerned that you've lost sight of what's truly important." "Which is?" I asked, taking a sip of wine and maintaining eye contact. "Your marriage, your future children, your role in this family," Jasper answered, leaning forward with the confidence of someone who'd never been challenged on his fundamental assumptions about how the world should work. "Look, I get it. You're smart, you're ambitious, and you probably feel like you have something to prove, but at the end of the day, what's more important, some business deal that might work out, or building a life with the people who love you?" "That's a fascinating question," I replied. "What exactly constitutes a life worth building?" Trevor shifted uncomfortably beside me. "Margot, I think what everyone's trying to say is that we want you to be happy, and this constant stress about work, this need to keep proving yourself professionally, it doesn't seem like it's making you happy." "You're right," I said, and I watched relief flash across several faces around the table. "I haven't been happy, but not for the reasons you think." Eleanor smiled with maternal satisfaction, clearly believing she was about to witness my emotional breakthrough and acceptance of proper priority. "You want to know what hasn't made me happy?" I continued, my voice remaining perfectly level. "Sitting at this table for 6 years, listening to my achievements get dismissed as little business projects and consulting work. Watching my husband nod along while his family explains why my education, my skills, and my professional success are obstacles to overcome rather than assets to celebrate." The temperature in the room shifted slightly, but Eleanor maintained her patronizing smile. "Darling, no one is dismissing your achievements. We're simply trying to help you understand perspective." "Perspective," I repeated. "Let me share some perspective with you." I set down my wine glass and looked around the table, making eye contact with each person who had spent the evening explaining my inadequacies. That phone call I just took, it was to confirm that the merger I've been working on for 2 years has officially been finalized. The transaction value is $512 million. My equity stake in the combined company makes me personally worth approximately $57 million as of today. The silence that followed was different from the earlier pause after Eleanor's ultimatum. This was the silence of people trying to process information that didn't fit into their existing worldview. 57 million, I repeated, letting the number settle over the table like dust after an explosion. That's roughly 3 times the net worth of everyone at this table combined. Penelope's mouth was slightly open, and Jasper had gone very still in that particular way of someone realizing they've made a catastrophic miscalculation. But here's the really interesting part, I continued, standing up from my chair and smoothing my burgundy dress. While you've been spending this evening explaining why I need to abandon my career to focus on what really matters, I've been sitting here thinking about what kinds of people deliver ultimatums to someone they claim to love. Eleanor had lost her maternal smile and was staring at me with something approaching shock. "Trevor," I said, turning to face my husband directly, "your mother just informed me that I have 1 year to choose between my professional life and our marriage. She explained that this family has standards and that my priorities are fundamentally incompatible with being your wife." Trevor's face was flushed, and he opened his mouth to speak, but I held up a hand. "The fascinating thing is that she's absolutely right. Our priorities are incompatible. You want a wife who will make your career more important than her own, who will consider her education and abilities obstacles to overcome, rather than strengths to leverage. You want someone who will be grateful for your family's tolerance of her ambitions, rather than someone whose ambitions deserve respect in their own right." I picked up my purse and walked toward the dining room entrance, then turned back to face the table of people who had just learned they'd been patronizing someone far more successful than any of them. "So thank you, Eleanor, for clarifying the choice. I choose my career, my self-respect, and my future over a family that considers my success an inconvenience to be managed." As I reached the doorway, I delivered my final line, "Oh, and Trevor, don't wait up." I drove straight to Marcus Chen's apartment in the city, my hands still shaking slightly from adrenaline and the surreal nature of what had just happened. Marcus had been my study partner at Harvard, the one person who'd understood from day one that I wasn't just ambitious. I was strategic. While other classmates networked at wine bars, Marcus and I spent Friday nights in the library, dissecting case studies and challenging each other's assumptions about market dynamics. More importantly, Marcus had been the first person I'd told about the Whitman Kelley opportunity 18 months ago. He'd helped me structure the initial financial projections and had spent countless evenings listening to me work through the complex legal and logistical challenges of bringing 2 completely different corporate cultures together. His building's doorman recognized me and waved me through without calling up. I'd been there often enough over the years for strategy sessions and moral support. When Marcus opened his apartment door and saw my face, he immediately stepped aside and handed me a glass of wine without asking any questions. "The deal closed," I said, collapsing onto his familiar couch that had witnessed countless late-night discussions about business theory and career strategy. "And," Marcus prompted, settling into the chair across from me with the patient attention of someone who knew this story had multiple layers. 57 million, I said, still not quite believing the number myself. Marcus was quiet for exactly 3 seconds, then broke into the biggest grin I'd ever seen on his face. "Margot Elizabeth Patterson, you brilliant, stubborn, impossible woman." He jumped up from his chair and pulled me into a hug that felt like vindication itself. This was what celebration was supposed to feel like. Someone who understood the magnitude of what I'd accomplished, who knew how many obstacles I'd overcome, who appreciated the vision and determination required to make something this complex actually work. "Tell me everything," he said, refilling my wine glass. "Start with Donna's call and don't leave out a single detail." So I did. I told him about standing in Eleanor's garden, listening to Donna explain the final valuation numbers, while through the French doors I could see my in-laws continuing their intervention about my misplaced priorities. I told him about the Forbes interview, about the press release that would go out in the morning, about the sudden realization that I had just achieved something extraordinary, while people who claimed to love me were explaining why my dreams were obstacles to overcome. And then, I said, reaching the climax of the story, I walked back in there and told them exactly what I thought of their ultimatum and their priorities. Marcus raised his glass in a toast. To the woman who just proved that the best revenge is massive success. It wasn't revenge, I said, though I was smiling. It was clarity. Even better. We were interrupted by Marcus's roommate Drew, who emerged from his bedroom wearing pajama pants and a confused expression. Drew was a journalist for the Financial Times, and when Marcus quickly explained what had happened, Drew's expression shifted from sleepy confusion to professional interest. "Wait," Drew said, now fully awake. "You're the architect behind the Whitman-Kelly merger? That's the deal everyone's been talking about in manufacturing circles. People are calling it the most innovative mid-market transaction in years." This was the difference between chosen family and biological family. Drew had never met me before tonight, but within 10 minutes he was asking intelligent questions about the strategic vision behind bridging traditional manufacturing with automation technology. He wanted to understand the complexity of the cultural integration, the brilliance of the financial structuring, the long-term implications for the industry. "You should write about this," Marcus told Drew. "Not just the business angle, but the personal story. Here's someone who saw an opportunity that established players missed, who had the expertise to make it happen, and who just became one of the youngest self-made multimillionaires in the country." While her husband's family was explaining why she needed to give up her career to focus on what really mattered, I added, and both men shook their heads in disgust. "Their loss," Drew said simply. "Though I'm guessing they're having some very interesting conversations right about now." We talked until almost midnight, the three of us sprawled across Marcus's living room, discussing everything from the technical aspects of the merger to the broader implications of what happens when people consistently underestimate someone's capabilities. For the first time in years, I felt like I was exactly where I belonged, surrounded by people who saw my success as something to celebrate rather than something to manage. My phone started ringing at 6:30 the next morning. Trevor, of course, followed by 3 missed calls from Eleanor, 2 from Jasper, and surprisingly, 1 from Penelope. I let them all go to voicemail while I sat in Marcus's guest room, drinking coffee and reading the Forbes article that had just gone live online. "Visionary dealmaker Margot Patterson reshapes manufacturing industry with $512 million merger," read the headline, accompanied by a professional photo I'd taken for my LinkedIn profile 6 months earlier. The article described me as one of the most innovative strategic minds in mid-market mergers, and quoted industry experts calling the Whitman-Kelly deal a template for how traditional businesses can evolve without losing their core identity. Reading about myself in Forbes, while my phone buzzed, with increasingly desperate calls from the family who'd dismissed my little business projects, felt like living in some kind of parallel universe. The voicemails were exactly what I'd expected. Trevor's first message was hurt and confused. "Margot, we need to talk. I know last night got heated, but walking out wasn't fair to anyone. Call me back." His second message, left an hour later, had a distinctly different tone. "I saw the Forbes article. Why didn't you tell me? We need to discuss this situation properly." Eleanor's message was a masterpiece of damage control disguised as maternal concern. "Margot, darling, I think there may have been some miscommunication last night. Of course, we're proud of your business success. We simply want to make sure you're taking care of your health and well-being. Perhaps we could have lunch this week to clear the air." Jasper's voicemail was more direct. "Margot, clearly we underestimated the scope of your current project. I'd like to discuss some potential synergies between your new venture and our investment services. Call me when you get a chance." But Penelope's message surprised me. Her voice was small and genuinely confused. "Margot, I keep reading this article and I can't understand why you never told us about any of this. I feel terrible about last night. I had no idea. I thought you were just doing some freelance consulting. Could we maybe get coffee? I'd like to understand better. I deleted Trevor's messages without responding, but something about Penelope's tone made me consider calling her back. Of everyone at that dinner table, she was the only one who hadn't actively participated in dissecting my life choices. She'd simply accepted the family narrative that my career was a phase I'd eventually outgrow. But first, I had more important calls to. I spent the morning establishing what I decided to call my new operating parameters. I called my lawyer to discuss divorce proceedings, contacted a real estate agent about finding my own place, and set up meetings with a financial advisor who specialized in sudden wealth management. By noon, I had appointments scheduled to completely restructure my life around my new reality. Marcus was at work, but he'd left me a note. Text me if the vultures start circling. Remember, you don't owe anyone an explanation for being successful. The vultures, as it turned out, started circling around 2 in the afternoon. Trevor showed up at Marcus's building, somehow having figured out where I was. The doorman called up to announce his arrival, and I had to decide whether to see him or not. Send him up, I said finally. If I was going to establish boundaries, I might as well start with the most important one. Trevor looked haggard when I opened the door, like he'd spent the entire morning trying to reconcile the woman he'd married with the woman described in the Forbes article. He was holding a copy of the magazine and flowers, the kind of generic bouquet you buy when you realize you've made a catastrophic error in judgment. Margot, he said, his voice careful and measured, I think we need to talk about what happened last night. What happened last night? I replied, stepping aside to let him into Marcus's apartment, is that your family delivered an ultimatum about my life choices, and I accepted their terms. But you never told me about the scope of what you were working on. $57 million, Margot? How could you not share something that significant? I studied his face, looking for any sign that he understood the fundamental problem with his question. Trevor, for 2 years, every time I tried to talk about this project, your family changed the subject. Every time I mentioned the complexity of what I was building, they smiled politely and asked when I was going to focus on having children. That's not. Last night, your mother literally told me I had 1 year to choose between my career and our marriage. She said my priorities were incompatible with being your wife, and you sat there and agreed with her. Trevor set the flowers down on Marcus's coffee table and ran his hands through his hair. I was trying to keep the peace. You know how Mother gets when she feels like family priorities are being questioned. Right. So my success is something that questions family priorities, rather than something that deserves celebration. Trevor was quiet for a long moment, staring at the Forbes magazine as if the words might rearrange themselves into something that made more sense with his worldview. Finally, he looked up at me with an expression I'd never seen before, something that might have been respect mixed with bewilderment. I don't understand how you did all this without me knowing, he said. You knew exactly as much as you wanted to know, I replied. Every time I tried to explain the complexity of what I was building, you glazed over. When I traveled to Ohio and California for meetings, you assumed I was struggling to find steady work. When I looked exhausted from 18-hour days structuring financial agreements, you suggested I consider something less stressful. But $57 million isn't the point, I interrupted. The point is that for 6 years I've been married to someone who saw my ambitions as problems to solve, rather than dreams to support. Last night just made that reality impossible to ignore. Trevor stood up and walked to Marcus's window, looking out at the city skyline. So what happens now? Now I build the life I actually want, instead of trying to fit into the life your family thinks I should want. I had already started making concrete plans. The merger had positioned me not just as wealthy, but as someone with significant influence in the manufacturing and technology sectors. Instead of just celebrating my financial success, I wanted to use this platform to create something meaningful, something that would redefine what the Patterson name meant in business circles. That afternoon, after Trevor left with his wilted flowers and wounded confusion, I drove to my hometown in Connecticut for the first time in months. I had an appointment with the dean of the local community college, a meeting I'd arranged that morning with a specific goal in mind. Dean Rebecca Thornfield was exactly the kind of person I'd hoped to meet: pragmatic, direct, and genuinely excited about innovative approaches to education. Her office was cluttered with student project displays and industry partnership proposals, the workspace of someone actually trying to bridge the gap between education and real-world application. "Miss Patterson," she said, shaking my hand with the firm grip of someone accustomed to making things happen, "I have to admit, when your assistant called this morning, I looked up that Forbes article. Quite an impressive accomplishment." "Thank you. I'm here because I want to do something meaningful with this opportunity, and I think education is where real change happens." I outlined my proposal: a comprehensive program that would teach practical business skills to students from working-class backgrounds, focusing specifically on the kind of strategic thinking and financial literacy that traditional business education often assumes students already possess. Not just theory, but hands-on experience with real companies, real deals, and real mentorship from professionals who understood what it meant to build something from nothing. "I want to fund full scholarships for 30 students per year," I explained. "But more than that, I want to create a pipeline from this program into real career opportunities. Students wouldn't just graduate with certificates, they'd graduate with job offers, with professional networks, and with the confidence that comes from knowing they can compete at the highest levels." Dean Thornfield leaned forward, her eyes bright with possibility. "What kind of funding are we talking about?" $2 million annually for the first 5 years. After that, we evaluate impact and scale accordingly." She was quiet for a moment, clearly calculating what that level of investment could accomplish. "And you want to base this here? In your hometown?" "I want to prove that exceptional talent exists everywhere, not just in elite zip codes. Some of the smartest, most determined people I know grew up in families where business school wasn't even considered a possibility. This program would change that." We spent 2 hours mapping out curriculum structure, partnership opportunities with local businesses, and recruitment strategies for identifying students with potential rather than just students with connections. By the end of our meeting, Dean Thornfield was practically vibrating with excitement about the possibilities. "There's one more thing," I said as we shook hands to conclude our meeting. "I want this program to be called the Patterson Center for Strategic Business Education. Not because I need recognition, but because I want my family name associated with creating opportunities rather than just preserving privileges." Driving home from that meeting, I felt something I hadn't experienced in years: complete alignment between my values, my capabilities, and my actions. The merger had given me financial independence, but this education initiative would give me something more important: the satisfaction of using my success to create pathways for others. My phone rang as I pulled into my driveway. Eleanor again, probably with another attempt at damage control, but this time I answered. "Hello, Eleanor." "Margot, darling, I'm so glad you picked up. I've been thinking about our conversation last night, and I realized there may have been some misunderstandings." "No misunderstandings," I said calmly. "You were very clear about your expectations, and I was very clear about my response. But surely we can work through this as a family. Your success reflects well on all of us, and—" "Eleanor," I interrupted, "my success has nothing to do with your family. It reflects my education, my work ethic, and my ability to see opportunities that others miss. Those qualities weren't developed at your dinner table. They were developed despite it." 6 months later, I stood in the conference room of the Patterson Center for Strategic Business Education, watching our first cohort of students present their capstone projects to a panel of industry executives. These weren't the polished, well-connected young people you'd find at elite business schools. These were kids from working-class families who'd never imagined they could compete in corporate boardrooms. Maya Gonzalez, a 19-year-old whose parents cleaned office buildings, was explaining her analysis of supply chain optimization in manufacturing. Her presentation was more insightful than proposals I'd seen from consultants charging 6-figure fees. James Wright, whose father worked construction, had developed a financial model for small business expansion that had 3 executives taking notes. This was what success actually looked like. Not dinner parties and charity galas, but creating opportunities for people who had the talent but lacked the access. Watching these students discover their own capabilities, seeing their confidence grow as they realized they belonged in these conversations, gave me a satisfaction that no merger valuation could match. The Forbes profile had led to other opportunities. I'd been invited to speak at conferences, to serve on boards, to consult on deals that would reshape entire industries. But none of those achievements felt as meaningful as Maya's presentation or James's financial models. My divorce from Trevor had been finalized 3 months earlier. He'd tried one last time to convince me that we could make it work, that his family could adjust their expectations now that they understood my success. But I'd realized something fundamental. I didn't want to be with people who had to adjust their expectations to respect me. I wanted to build a life with people who saw my potential before I proved it, who supported my dreams before they became profitable. My relationship with my own family had also transformed, though in a different way. When news of the merger broke, my parents had called immediately, not to apologize for years of dismissing my ambitions, but to express pride in my accomplishments. It was genuine, and I appreciated it, but it also confirmed something I'd suspected for years. Their validation was conditional on external recognition. The real peace came from discovering that I no longer needed their approval, or Eleanor's or anyone's. The 18-year-old girl who'd hidden financial statements under her bed. The Harvard student who'd been told business was too aggressive for someone of her background. The young wife who'd endured years of condescending dinner conversations. She had been building towards something that couldn't be diminished by other people's limited vision. I kept a photo on my desk from the Patterson Center's opening ceremony. In it, I'm standing with Dean Thornfield and our first class of scholarship recipients. My smile in that photo is different from any smile in family pictures. It's the expression of someone who'd figured out how to measure success by her own standards, rather than seeking approval from people who were fundamentally incapable of seeing her clearly. The irony was that achieving financial independence had been less transformative than I'd expected. The money was nice, certainly. It provided security and options that I'd never had before. But the real transformation had come from understanding that my worth wasn't determined by other people's recognition or approval. 3 weeks ago, I'd received a wedding invitation from Beatrice, who was remarrying after her divorce from Preston. The invitation was addressed only to me, no, and guest, which felt like a small acknowledgement that my marital status wasn't what defined my place in the family. I'd sent a generous gift and a polite note declining to attend. Some relationships were worth fighting for, worth the effort of education and patience. Others were simply incompatible with the person you'd become. Learning the difference between those 2 categories was perhaps the most valuable skill I'd developed. Standing in that conference room, watching students who reminded me of my younger self discover their own capabilities, I felt something I'd spent decades seeking: complete peace with who I was and what I'd built. The validation I'd been chasing had been within me all along. I just needed to stop looking for it in people who were incapable of providing it. The Patterson name now meant something different than it had 6 months ago. Instead of representing compromise and diminished expectations, it represented vision, determination, and the radical act of defining success on your own terms. That felt like a legacy worth building. You know what the most surprising part of this whole journey was? It wasn't the money, though obviously that changed everything. It wasn't even the professional recognition, though seeing my name in Forbes still feels surreal. The most surprising part was discovering that the validation I'd been desperately seeking from other people had been available inside me all along. How many of us spend years, maybe decades, trying to prove our worth to people who are fundamentally incapable of seeing our value? How many dreams get abandoned because the people closest to us can't envision a reality different from their own limited experience? I want to hear your stories. Have you ever been told that your ambitions were too big, too risky, too different from what people expected? Have you ever sat at a dinner table while family members explained why your dreams were obstacles to overcome rather than goals to celebrate? Drop a comment and let me know, because I guarantee you're not alone in feeling like you're fighting for recognition from people who will never truly understand what drives you. If my journey resonated with you, please like, subscribe, and share it with someone who needs to hear that it's okay to define success on their own terms. Sometimes the most radical thing you can do is stop seeking approval from people who are invested in keeping you small. The world needs what you're building, even if the people closest to you can't see it yet. Trust your vision, trust your capabilities, and trust that the right people will recognize your value, even if they're not the people you expected to celebrate. Your worth isn't determined by other people's ability to understand your dreams. It's determined by your courage to pursue them anyway.